Good afternoon from London. I want to welcome everyone to the LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and director of the U.S. Center at the LSE, which is hosting today's roundtable on the 2020 U.S. election. Well, here we are, a couple days after the end of the presidential campaign that has produced the highest voter turnout in a long time and leaving Americans and folks around the world on the edge of their seats. And it's not over. As of this hour, Joe Biden has amassed over 72 million votes, or 50.4% of the popular vote, and a lead in the all-important Electoral College of 253 to 214 votes. As counting continues in several battleground states, including Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Results are expected later today in two states that could put Biden over the top, Nevada and Arizona. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is charging voter fraud and already challenging the count in key swing states in the courts. Even if Biden does prevail, he will be the first president in 32 years to take office without his party in charge of Congress. At the end of the day, America may have said that they've had enough of President Trump, but it's already clear that even if Biden wins, voters have not given the Democrats a green light to govern as they see fit. The Republicans will, in all likelihood, control the Senate, to say nothing of the Democrats' lackluster performance down ballot at the state level. Many were hoping that this election would do something to clarify politics in the United States. I think if there's one thing it won't be remembered for, it is political clarity. The country remains deeply divided at a time when it is reeling from the pandemic and social unrest. Making sense of all of this is no easy feat, especially as it's unfolding as we meet here on the platform. Fortunately, we had the good sense at the U.S. Center to schedule in ahead of time a group of distinguished scholars who have written extensively about the American presidency, party politics, electoral trends, public policy, and more, and who can help us, I think, begin to ask the right questions about the moment that we're in. Joining me on the panel today in alphabetical order are Professor Meena Bose, the Peter S. Calico Chair in Presidential Studies at Hofstra University and the author of Shaping and Signaling Presidential Policy. Dr. David Smith, Senior Lecturer in American Politics and Foreign Policy at the University of Sydney, and the author of Religious Persecution and Political Order in the United States. Professor Jeffrey Tulis of the University of Texas at Austin, and author of The Rhetorical Presidency, and most recently, Legacies of Losing in American Politics. And Dr. Linda Yu, Chair of the LSE Economic Diplomacy Commission, visiting professor at LSE Ideas, and author of The Great Economist, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to have you on the platform. I can assure you there are a lot of folks watching who are eager to hear what you have to say. Before we get down to business, let me just say a few words about today's format. To get us started, I've asked each of our panelists to take a few minutes to share some initial thoughts and reflections on where we are at this juncture in the election. We've left plenty of time for audience questions, so please send your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation so I can mention them when I put your questions to our panelists. Now, normally at this point, I would ask all of you in the audience to put your hands together to give our panelists a warm LSE welcome, and that of course is not possible today. So in lieu of applause, I really encourage you to pose questions to the panelists in the Q&A period, and I will do my level best to get in as many as possible. And with that, let me turn to one of our guests from across the pond, Professor Bose. Mina, good to have you with us. The platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for inviting me. It's delighted to be on this roundtable with distinguished colleagues, and excited to see so many people who want to understand what just happened. And maybe I would just say, just kind of slightly edited to say, and what's happening now, because the election is very much still in progress. I'll be brief. There are many topics, I think, for all of us to discuss, but just a little kind of point of comparison. In 2016, I found myself staying up, I think, until about 1:30 or so in the morning when after Pennsylvania was called, and I was waiting to see if Hillary Clinton would speak, and it turned out that she wasn't going to. So at that point, I went to sleep. I thought 2020, all the predictions were on election day that it was going to be a quick evening. And yet I found myself staying up later because I wanted to hear the president speak. And so that was till about 2:30 in the morning. So something is happening in American politics. And let me try to offer a few thoughts for us to discuss. The first issue, I think we as political scientists and as students of the American presidency and American politics have to contend with is polling. What happened? There were a number of critiques of polling in 2016. I've spent a lot of time teaching this, my classes, we've spent time discussing it. At Hofstra, which is where I teach, we started a poll last fall, was very excited about putting this together. And our poll concluded, I should say, in October that Biden was favored to win by 11 points. So we were in that double-digit margin. I'm beginning to think now I prefer archival research to polling analysis. But let me just say, I think we have to figure out why are the polls off? And there is a margin of error, but certainly the double-digit predictions or the averages, if you look at Real Clear Politics or 538, a number of the news websites, all had Biden comfortably ahead by about 7 to 8 points, and then some of them were double digits. So we know from 2016 that there were undecided voters that some of the surveys didn't capture, and that there was also a significant difference between non-college educated and college educated voters. The 2020 polls accounted for that. And we know that there weren't as many, there were less than 5% of undecided voters. We did a poll in September and then one in October, very little shift in perspective in that month. So there's something else that was missing. Was it election day turnout versus early voting and absentee turnout? Are there were issues with the state by state polls as well? Are our samples insufficiently representative? Something there that we need to understand. And I would say that polling is important, and we need to understand this snapshot of where the public stands, not just on candidates, but also on policy issues. So I think this is still, until all the votes are in and the election is decided, it's difficult to kind of make a definitive assessment. But without a doubt, we need to figure out the state of polling in American politics and why the narrowness of victory, or the narrow margin, I should say at this point, since we don't know the results, why that wasn't reflected in public opinion polls across the board. Second point I would just make, federalism. I teach the American presidency and public policy, and I've spent more time in the past month on the National Conference of State Legislatures website and on Ballotpedia to look at variations on absentee balloting rules, on poll opening and closing times, on election count, early voting rules. Now looking at rules on the Electoral College and faithless electors. The United States has 50 jurisdictions plus Washington, D.C., that cast votes in the presidential race and that determine presidential selection. And this is a complicated and lengthy process. Until 2000, we hadn't seen, for the most part, it was the Electoral College. I would say I spent half a class on this. It would generally strengthen or reinforce the popular vote results. Now that we've seen in 2000 and 2016, two elections where the popular vote and electoral college vote didn't match up, and now a third election where certainly if the popular vote, if former Vice President Biden wins, then we will see the popular vote and the electoral college vote match up, but it will be a narrow margin. If you look at the numbers with all of the states, including the ones where there are legal challenges, I think the maximum that's predicted could be for Biden would be 321. So that would be giving Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. So we were just doing this in class this morning. You can calculate, but it's 321 for President Trump. If he were to hold everything from 2016, so that would be 306, and win Nevada, it would be 312. 312 and 321 are by no means the mandates that we've kind of taught about with the way we traditionally discuss the Electoral College. This is an institution that in American politics now, I would say, is certainly the legitimacy is very much being brought into question. And then the last point, Peter, I know everyone has, we have a number of comments to address here, but I would just say there are questions now as we make the transition from elections to governance, which is not happening yet. But what do the election results tell us about what the American national agenda needs to be in 2021? I think obviously questions about the pandemic, the economy, and then the kind of future American priorities on climate change, race relations, healthcare. These are issues that need to be addressed, and we see a nation that is by no means, where there is by no means a consensus on any of these very difficult issues. So with that, I'll turn it over.
There we go. So, David, thank you, Mina. That's great. That gets us started here. First of all, David, I don't know, you deserve some kind of like a gold medal or gold star because it's an ungodly hour and you're up down there, down under. So when you look at what's going on, you've been following American politics and writing about it for a long time. What's the takeaway from down under, just looking at it, big picture, kind of some thoughts?
To me, the takeaway is the vast turnout in this election, which I think is in many ways as surprising as any other aspect of the result. The fact that more than 100 million people voted early, and we're probably going to see numbers in the end. I saw one estimate which suggests Trump will probably end up with about 75 million votes, which would be 12 million more than he got last time. And Biden will end up with about 81 million votes. So we're talking about a huge level of enthusiasm for this election in the middle of a pandemic. And I think it says something, well, I think it says a lot about Trump as president. On the one hand, he has the ability to turn out his side like no one else. On the other hand, he has the ability to turn out the other side like no one else. And obviously, the president is always central to US politics, but Trump has somehow been unusually central to American politics. Just looking at some data from the MIT Center for Civic Media a few weeks ago, normally presidents feature in about 10% of news stories in the US. Trump has featured in about 25% of news stories in the US throughout his presidency. He has absolutely dominated the media, dominated the attention of Americans. And party divisions and negative partisanship had really been growing in the US for about 25 years before Trump became president. But during Trump's presidency, it has increasingly become all about him. Politics is defined in terms of being pro and anti-Trump. And feelings have just been running so high in the last 4 years, and especially this year. The kinds of protests that we saw in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, this was the biggest wave of protest mobilization in the United States since the 1960s. And it wasn't the only wave of protest mobilization that we saw this year. There were anti-lockdown protests. There were numerous protests before the election. There are protests happening after the election. There is just an incredible amount of mobilization going on in the US at the moment. And a lot of that really reflects what a divisive figure Trump is and the kinds of feelings that he inspires on both sides. So no matter what the outcome is, I think that that's the kind of clear picture that we have of American politics. And I think that even if Trump loses, he will be the symbolic leader of the opposition. I think it's highly likely he would be running for the candidacy again in 2024, and you would have to say that he's the front runner at this point. So even if he loses, he's not going anywhere. And I think in some sense, politics will continue to be about him, which is maybe not something that a lot of people want to hear, but I think that that could be the case.
You ready for me, Peter?
Yeah, so Jeff, you and I have, well, we've known each other for a long time. You have spent a lot of time writing and blogging about the Trump presidency, American democracy, this campaign. I don't know, your thoughts like 2 days after Election Day, you know, kind of wherever we are.
My answer to the panel's question, what happened, is we're experiencing a near-death experience for the American polity. I actually think it's somewhat of a mistake to try to think about this in terms of elections as we normally talk about them after the fact. For example, we sometimes ask whether there's going to be a partisan realignment, or some of the points that Peter made, which are perfectly reasonable about what happens if you don't control the whole government but have divided government. All that's fine. But what was at stake in this election was the very viability of the constitutional order, the very sustenance of the American political experiment. And had Trump won, and it appears that he's not going to win, it's over. It's done. Now, having possibly been removed from office, what a near-death experience means is that we're in some sort of situation analogous to cancer. We don't know whether it's a long-term terminal cancer. We don't know whether it's treatable, but we are a sick nation. Think about this, that Trump actually, whether he wins or loses, did better in many, many respects than he did against Hillary Clinton. It was just pointed out by David, he got the most votes that any Republican in American history that's run for president has gotten. And he is obviously, you know, we talk about Hillary being defeated. She lost by, you know, a few votes in a few states. And he's going to lose as well by a few votes in a few states. The exceptions being if he loses as expected in Arizona, that's a new development, or Georgia. But both of those really aren't explained by anything the Biden campaign did. That they're explained more by, in Arizona's case, Cindy McCain and the organization of a labor union down there for Latinos. And in Georgia's case, the infrastructure that Stacey Abrams put together there. But I mention that only as a footnote to the basic point that Trump did really, really well in this election, despite all his outrages, despite impeachment, despite COVID, despite a tanking economy. despite the trauma and destruction of alliances around the world, despite cozying up with dictators without any discernible benefit to the national interest, despite all his outrages, despite all these behaviors, any one of which would have sunk any other candidate. I mean, Hillary arguably lost the election because James Comey spoke out of turn. That happens every hour. Something equivalent to that happens every hour of the Trump presidency. And it not only doesn't weaken him, taken collectively, it somehow strengthens him. It numbs the polity in general to his behavior, and it somehow provides some sort of fodder for those who enable him. So that's my basic takeaway, that we're in a very, very, very seriously bad situation in the United States.
Linda. So we're in the UK. Many stayed up into the wee hours Wednesday morning following the election returns, and wondering in part what it meant for American democracy, as Jeff has suggested, but also wondering about what it meant for the United States internationally. And I think in a post-Brexit UK, what the heck it meant for the United Kingdom. So, some thoughts. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, I think like all of you, it's been a very sleepless couple of nights. And the next time somebody promises me we're going to know the result, I'm going to make them put money on it, because I think this is, just extraordinary. And I think that's sort of my first, comment, which is the United States as the most important economy in the world. Who wins this election does have a big impact on, I would say, certainly on the style, but also there will be substantial differences in terms of the conduct of the United States on the world stage. Now, I think the style point has already been mentioned a few times, so I won't belabor that, but I'll just maybe sum it up in a quote that I have taken from somebody else, which is, if President Biden wins, which it looks like we're headed to, although I should stress President Trump still has a narrow path to victory, but I'm sure we will talk more about that. Should the presidency go to Joe Biden, then the world has been made safer for cocktail parties. The kind of the style point, and I think it's actually a hugely important point, even though I'm making it in a slightly facetious way, because a lot of the conduct of this election, from the record turnout that we've already discussed, to, as you mentioned, Peter, the split between the presidency and what's happened, with the Republicans retaining the Senate, and of course, the appointments to the Supreme Court. The record turnout has actually not led to one unified picture. It's actually quite a split picture. And I think that obviously is going to have implications for the conduct of policy, including foreign policy, although, as we all know, there's areas in which the United States president does have a substantial role in this area, even if they can't do as much, for instance, on domestic policy. So I think in terms of the United States' place in the world, I think should President Trump win, I think we will get a lot more of, America first. And I think we will maybe a little bit, cocktail parties are slightly less safe. But should the presidency go to Joe Biden, I think the United States will have a more multilateral role on the world stage. Now, there's going to be a number of issues where the bipartisan stance on US policy, foreign policy, won't change. Top of mind there is vis-a-vis China. I think the competitiveness between the world's two biggest economies, I think that is one of the issues in which we should expect maybe a different style, but the substance will still be that of competition and power and And that, I think, is going to continue regardless of the outcome of the election. I think for us here in the UK, and thinking about the role of the sort of the UK in the 21st century global economy, you know, the special relationship with the United States, you know, I think that is always a big topic of discussion. But I think I would just kind of quickly say, I think for a United States looking to build bridges, I actually think Europe, you know, will be, of course, more of a priority under Biden presidency. But I also would not discount a continuation of President Obama's Asia pivot, which, of course, Biden was in the Obama administration as vice president. So there was always this kind of pincer movement as to where the United States saw its biggest markets, as well as its allies. And I could expect that to continue. And I think there's a bit of nervousness in terms of the relationships that might need to be built, depending on how, you know, all of this plays out between the UK and the US. And I think finally, where I do think we will see a big difference is in the United States playing more of a leadership role on multilateral issues. So climate change, but not just that. If you look at the impasse at the top of selecting the next head of the World Trade Organization, appointing appellate judges to the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, the role of the World Health Organization, that does require a commitment to multilateralism, which I think we would see with the Biden presidency. I think there are issues with defining that global role vis-a-vis the competition with China, but I think that will be a significant change for the rest of us as you have a United States who will still be concerned with the domestic impact of the global choices they make, but the attitude will be more open to the United States, its more traditional role as a leader in the multilateral system. So I think I'll pause there. There's a lot more obviously to go through, Peter, but I think on that point, I hope I've given you a hopeful point to hand back.
So that's great, Linda. And I think I want to come back to the international side in a minute. Let me just simply say that we've got about 700, we have more than 750 people on the platform, ranging from Puerto Rico to India to Singapore, Italy, Sudan, the UK, and the United States. Welcome, everybody. You know, boy, there's a lot on the table here. I think I was looking, you know, at this point, I'm not completely confident in the exit polling because the exit polling actually does not really fully reflect the nature of the vote. I mean, this is, you know, because it is so heavily, such a large portion of the vote is mail-in. Nevertheless, I don't think that this will change this much what I'm about to talk about with the when the mail-ins are, if they're factored into this. There are some really interesting demographic divisions, and one of them that has really been, I think it's like solidified under the Trump presidency. It is really, you can see it very starkly in the the voting behavior here. I think if we can put up the third one of the, I think it's maybe the last slide, which is a breakdown of, I don't know if the technician can hear me. Well, it's a breakdown of the college educated versus non-college educated vote in the United States. And right now, when you look at white non-college educated voters, 64% of them have gone to Donald Trump. You get a more or less like a 50-50 split when you're looking at white college educated voters. There's interesting things going on with African American voters, also with Latino voters. This strikes me as one of the really interesting developments, and the Democratic Party simply needs to find a way to reach out to what were traditionally Democratic voters, but have basically been lost by the party. And, you know, to Jeff's point, are attracted by many of the things that, you know, the kind of what you're, you know, classifying, I think correctly, as kind of anti-democratic behavior, does not really threaten these voters. They seem to be much more concerned about the agenda that they see that the Democratic Party is advancing. And one wonders, you know, even if Donald Trump leaves and is not running again in 2024, I mean, is this really where the Republican Party has gone and will be? I mean, we do hear people like Tom Cotton, you know, invoking kind of like the white working class voter as being kind of central to the Republican Party. And I guess the question is there any way for the Democratic Party to reach out to these voters and to, because it seems to be a core part of the polarization and the division that's going on in the US right now. It's not really directed at anybody in particular. I don't know if somebody wants to pick it up. Maybe not. David does. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that we've seen in this election is quite a stark difference between some of the electoral results and some of the policy preferences expressed through other things that were on the ballot.
Right.
So in Florida, for example, we saw a 4-point win to President Trump, but we also saw a proposal passed to raise the minimum wage to $15.
Exactly.
In multiple states, we've seen proposals to legalize marijuana. Then on the other side of the country, in California, which is going to have a resounding Democratic majority, we got the Proposal 22 passed, which essentially allows gig economy platforms not to treat their employees as employees, but as independent contractors, which is something that could have ramifications for the whole country in terms of the level of precarity that it creates. I don't think that Democrats are going to be able to compete with this group until they have consistent policies that deal with the problem of precarity in every area, from unemployment to healthcare. While Democrats don't actually have an answer to that, I think that cultural issues are going to continue to be more and more important for that group.
Yeah.
So,
Jeff, thoughts about this?
yeah, I'll pick up on David's point, starting from his first remarks, because I think it's important to reemphasize the point he made that Trumpism lives on after Trump, even if he's defeated, and as he's pointed out, maybe even Trump himself.
Right.
But either way, as you point out, Peter, Tom Cotton would pick up the mantle. Somebody is going to carry the Trump banner, and while I think it's true that the Democrats need to figure out a way to get to this large group of people that used to be Democrats, part of the problem is that when you think about the Trump campaign, first of all, the platform is the first in Republican history that doesn't exist. There's no platform. The platform was whatever Trump wants.
Exactly.
So then Trump's campaign policies or this campaign objectives became the Republican Party's platform. And it turned out that they weren't programmatic at all. They were grievances. And, you know, all of the stuff Trump does.
Right.
And so that sort of grievance politics appeals to this group, and it has had the effect of bringing out into the open in the United States the latent racism that has been in our country since the beginning, but has, you know, for many, many years, one could say that one of the salutary effects of hypocrisy was the suppression of overt racism. It was always there, but people sort of felt embarrassed about it, embarrassed to express it. And Trump actually gave permission, in effect, to be openly racist. And we now have, neo-Nazi groups and Proud Boys and all these sorts of groups that are sort of licensed from the top. That's a huge, huge shift in American politics, which we thought of as somehow over time, bending the arc toward justice and all that, the way Obama would talk about.
Right.
This is a tremendous, wake-up call for what's really going on in the United States. And it poses a very, very significant problem, because how does the Democratic Party connect the bread and butter issues that connected it to that big group that you're talking about, Peter, with the problem of racism and grievance politics and all that?
Could I just add, Peter,
Yeah.
do we have a second?
Go ahead, man.
I just kind of picking up on what David and Jeff said. I think we're really at 2020 has become a crossroads election, which we said this about 2008, we said this about 2016, but a fundamental challenge in the United States today is that we can't agree on what the problems are, let alone even decide how to address them. And that applies to questions of race relations, healthcare, the government's role in economic assistance, and then probably most fundamentally, and I think the issue that I know we'll get to, and it's unique to 2020, is the pandemic. There are really two starkly diametrically opposed, right, if you will, views presented from the two presidential candidates. President Trump basically saying, let's move on, right? And that clearly has a large source of appeal in the country. And then Biden saying that we need to set these rules. We need to have this is going to be a long haul. If we don't even have agreement on the extent of the problem that the pandemic brings, and this isn't unique to the United States, but this is then addressing questions about healthcare reform or educational assistance, or how to address questions about police brutality, race relations. The United States is not in agreement on identifying what the problems are, let alone even with the policy platforms. I agree with Jeff, but the Democratic policy platform, while they have one, there are significant intra-party disputes that are going to have to be addressed. And then of course that's true within the Republican Party as well. So I just think that I'm optimistic that we can address this, that these problems can be addressed, but I'm not sure what that suggests for action in the near future.
And I also come in on this, Peter.
Yeah, sure, then.
I think a lot will be made in the analysis once this is all over, whenever that might be, about Biden winning Wisconsin and Michigan, two of the Rust Belt states that were very important in Trump's victory 4 years ago. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of discussion around whether or not that means the Democratic Party can appeal to the Rust state. But of course, Trump taking, I think, is Ohio and Iowa, as well as others, makes this, as I say, it's going to be an analysis and a discussion. And I think Nina's comments just triggered one of the exit polls that I saw, which was that a lot of voters for Biden cared about COVID. Now, of course, economics, my area, is always the economy stupid, but the pandemic has been such a big factor that one of the polls that I saw essentially split this as if you cared about the economy more, I guess, and you're worried about Biden raising your taxes, then those were the voters for Trump. Those who cared about the pandemic and COVID voted for Biden. And I think that is, perhaps it's unique to this year, but I think that is, something which is also worth dissecting in due course. And then just finally, you mentioned there's going to be some fairly interesting analyses on trends of voting, I'm sure, after this. And of course, Asian Americans, a group that doesn't get as much publicity as others. It, as well as the Latino community, as well as the African American community, there's some very interesting splits within those communities and different drivers as to, they are, I think, for the Asian American community, which is less analyzed in 10 of the swing states, the fact that their populations might have made a difference, I think will also begin to point to some of the, I think the real structural changes in the US electorate around issues that I'm not sure that we have yet fully to grasp. But I will personally find it very interesting to see whether or not this, this demographic, which doesn't get much coverage, but tends to vote, turnout tends to be pretty good, might have had an effect in some of these swing states.
Can I say a word more about COVID?
Yes,
Because I think COVID is really a distinct issue. A lot of times when we're talking about Trump, he's a symptom of something. It's not just him, he's the result.
Yeah.
But in COVID, all the problems that you see, and as Amina or somebody rightly pointed out, the surprising division in the way that people responded to it, and the fact that for many it played such a little role in their assessment of who to vote for in the election, all of that is actually a result of Trump's own decisions. It wasn't a pre-existing division in American politics over how to deal with a pandemic. And I would even submit that had he chosen, or he'd been able to, but he'd never had the experience really of governing before. But if he had actually stepped up and said, look, like a normal president, we've got to come together. Here's the public health crisis. Here's how we're going to handle it. We've made a couple mistakes along the way, but we're fixing them, and let the scientists talk each day, and just what normal presidents do. I actually think he would have won this election pretty handily, because all of the people that were his so-called base would have voted for him anyway, and independents and others who really do care about COVID there's a rally around the flag effect, as you know, for presidents in crises, which he himself experienced. His highest approval ratings were at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, when he hadn't actually, laid out his disruptive approach to it. And so I actually think that it's evidence of a kind of distinctive effect of his own sort of arbitrary, capricious, dictatorial sort of personality that we got the COVID phenomena play out in the United States the way it did.
or maybe, I've thought about this too. The instinctive effort to define the issue in very kind of partisan terms. He basically framed it as a partisan issue. And the guy's been doing that essentially since the beginning of his presidency. Because it is so striking that this issue, the pandemic, which normally, given the incompetent management, you would have expected a president to really take it in the neck electorally,
right.
in a big way, whether it's a pandemic or the economy. And somehow it got reframed as where you stand,
Right.
Kind of party in a big sense, like a kind of conception of America. And to some degree, he in some sense, he pulled that off. He is going to lose the popular vote. He's going to lose the popular vote by a larger margin than he did last time, it looks like. And probably, if things go the way they're going, lose the presidency. But still, it's a lot closer than people would have thought if you had a referendum on your handling and your management of a crisis.
Well,
Right, but if he had but what I'm trying to say is, if he'd actually attempted to handle it,
yeah,
even though and handle it well enough that it mitigated some deaths, but it was still a terrible, terrible crisis.
Yeah.
He, like a wartime president, he would be given credit for that in a way, and wouldn't be punished in the way that you normally are punished for the economy tanking and all that. I think you're right that his framing it in partisan ways prevented him from being punished for his mismanagement of it. But what I'm trying to suggest is, had he attempted to manage it responsibly, he would have been rewarded heartily by that. I think he would have won the election.
Yeah. Well, we don't disagree. So people want to get in though, and then I've got to open it up because it's like. But Mina, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I mean, I just say, because I agree with exactly with what Jeff said. And this was a lot, the articles in the spring were talking about a time for wartime, right? This was crisis leadership, wartime leadership, that this could unify, right? In some ways that there would be a unified effort in the country. And what's really interesting about that is when we think about the fact that there was an impeachment trial in January 2020. So we started this year with impeachment, went to the pandemic. It looked like there was an opportunity, right, for kind of, this would have been unprecedented if, and I guess would still happen, that an impeached president would win re-election in a time of economic distress and this, once in a century pandemic. But then the other point I would just say, though, is that the president, although he's losing the popular vote, right, this has a strong base of support. Won Florida. I mean, look at Florida, right? Won Florida more strongly than in 2016. Democrats have lost 2 House seats in Florida. This is, it's not clear to me. And again, if you look at the vote in Nebraska that Joe Biden won, right? That won the 2nd district. If President Trump had won that, like he did in 2016, there would be a possibility of a 269-269 split. So I agree with Jeff that this kind of the wartime leadership strategy could have been a clear path to victory, but these are still narrow margins. And I think that the president calculated that this would be sufficient to prevail.
Okay, we're going to open it up to, we've got a lot of questions coming in. There's 80 questions in the Q&A box. So,
Peter, just before we open it up to questions, can I just quickly address one thing that was on one of the other slides, which was about the Latino vote?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, so those exit polls showing 35% of the Latino vote going to Trump. I mean, with the caveat that we can't entirely trust these exit polls, although they will get more reliable. Sorry, 32%. They will get more reliable when adjustments are made according to results. So that 32% is an improvement from what Trump got last time, which was an improvement from what Mitt Romney had got the time before that, although it is something of a regression to historical norms. Latinos have never been an exclusively Democratic voting group. Those of you from Texas will remember how much of the Latino vote George W. Bush was able to get out. But I think this Latino improvement is significant. And one of my theories about why this has happened is there's a really growing evangelical Latino community in the United States. They're often stereotyped as Catholic, but in fact, evangelicals are the biggest growing segment of Latinos. In Florida, for example, 30% of Latinos are Protestant and 10% of them are Pentecostal Christians, which is a group that very, very strongly backs Donald Trump. And I think there's a real story here about Latino mobilization within religious communities, especially within those evangelical and Pentecostal communities. I think that this is going to be a major factor in the Latino vote going forward. Although also on the other side of politics, as has already been pointed out, if Biden wins Nevada and Arizona, it's going to be because of the mobilization of Latino labor unions in those states. If he wins Pennsylvania and Georgia, it's going to be because of Black mobilization in those states. The reason he won Wisconsin and Michigan was because of mobilization among African-American voters in Detroit and Milwaukee. So although Trump has made gains with non-white voters, especially Latino voters, Latino and African-American voters are still absolutely central to any kind of prospects for democratic power.
Okay, that's great. And I think you're going to be able to drill down even a little bit more on that. I'm going to take some questions here. This first one is from Ginny. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 questions and we'll, kind of sort them through the panel. You'll decide which ones you want to pick up. Ginny Hamilton Barnes asks, how can the US consider itself a city upon a hill and a beacon of liberalism, when its very electoral system, which is the crux of the democratic process, is so flawed and there's no movement to reform it. So a question, I think, about the Electoral College, the disparity with the electoral vote. Mina, it does go back to your opening comment and so forth, so maybe you could take the lead on this. A question from an older student, Joseph Bacuza asks, and this actually, in a sense, David, may be something that you could pick up since you just were referring to labor unions. Has the destruction of the union base over the past decade or two been a leading cause of the white working voter drifting over to the Republican Party? So what's the connection between the erosion of labor in the United States, and this is of course a phenomenon across the OECD, but in the United States, and the growth of the Republican Party? And a question from Mark Hoffman, who is a colleague in the International Relations Department. And I'm going to frame this as for everyone here. Given Biden's natural bipartisan predisposition or disposition, is there an opportunity here actually for the Republican Party, if Biden's elected, so kind of post-Trump, to the Republican Party to pivot away from Trump and Trumpism? And I think that the question here really goes to, Jeff, these are people that you know, the kind of Lincoln Project Republicans. Where do these folks go? You know, who do they align with? I mean, this speaks to the cleavage inside the party. Yes, Cindy McCain did a lot to, you know, may have helped deliver, you know, Arizona. But when it comes to kind of like the future of kind of governing in a Biden administration, I mean, is there room, or will these people come over to the Democratic Party? What happens to them? Are we just, it's so polarized and Trump owns it so much that there's no home for them? So 3 different questions. One on labor unions and what's happened to them and the implications. The implications of America's electoral system internationally and the kind of the American brand and what's happened to it. And then maybe to talk a little bit more about the possibilities perhaps for something different in the Republican Party, a different vision of the Republican Party than, let's say, Trump or Tom Cotton.
Do you want me to
Why
start?
don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, you're making the Electoral College kind of easy in comparison to that last one. But let me, you know, this is, I would say, first of all, it's an excellent question. And there are several proposals, right? For changing the system of presidential selection. Probably the most well-known today is the National Popular Vote Compact, right? Which would keep the Electoral College, but award each state's Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins the National Popular Vote. Some 15 states have signed on to it with the proviso that it would go into effect if the number of 270 were reached. I'm not going to go into all of those details at this point. But what I will say is that, you know, again, and I said this in my opening remarks, that, you know, until 2000, we really didn't spend a lot of time discussing the Electoral College. I don't remember spending a lot of time in my college classes, graduate school, in teaching it. The last time there was a split before 2000 was 1888. An election has not gone to the House of Representatives since 1824. Seems very unlikely this in 2020. Unless there are faithless electors, right? Again, I don't think that's likely in 2020, but that is also an issue. I think when we look at the Electoral College, I think is an excellent illustration of the challenge of seeing whether an 18th century institution that the framers really decided as a compromise among between advocates for direct election of the president versus legislative selection large states versus small states, a number of other questions about representation, and this gets into questions about who was permitted to participate in the selection process initially. This institution has somehow endured, right? And there really is not, I think, a lot of clarity that the framers had thought much past George Washington as far as what would happen. And of course, we have the change of the 12th Amendment, the separate election for president and vice president. I guess what I would say here is there is a question as to whether the Electoral College is a suitable mechanism for electing the president in the 21st century. There's also a question of whether you can make that decision of institutional change at a time where it is so clearly linked to results. And if your position is that it needs to be changed because of, right, which is reasonable because of this discrepancy, it's viewed very much, I think, has become another party issue. So the prospect for an institutional reform, I think, becomes part of a larger question of the structure of the American political system. And that makes reform and addressing this question of legitimacy even harder to figure out.
Okay, hey, David and Linda, maybe on the, Jeff, do you want to speak to this?
I just thought I'd add something to Mina's topic. So, because the questioner asked, how could it be a country committed to democracy would have this kind of archaic institution? And in addition to what Mina said about the prospects for changing it, the answer to the question is, for most of American history, first, it didn't work as originally designed. And it became the mechanism, the principal reason we have a two-party system in the United States rather than a multi-party system. And the principal reason those two parties for most of American history were relatively moderate and not extreme. And then finally, it tended until recently to enhance the issue of legitimacy because people that would win a narrow popular vote would win a much wider electoral vote. And that may even be the case this time. So for all those reasons, a lot of people thought that the Electoral College, up until very recently, up until 2000, and the things that Mina's been talking about that have come to her attention and all of our attention, until then, a lot of people thought, well, it was actually not only compatible with democracy, but it sort of helped the American style of democracy.
Let's pick up the question. I mean, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Maybe something on the labor issue, David or Linda. I mean, and kind of how the decline of labor, which began before Ronald Reagan in the United States, but certainly accelerated from the 1980s on. The extent to which that has had explains the shift of kind of non-college educated voters moving to the Republican Party. And maybe, David, if we could bring in the extent to which that's the explanation, or it is a set of cultural issues that, is at work there. Linda, some thoughts on this?
I think that is part of the explanation. As you say, this has been going on for a very long time, and it's really been accelerated since NAFTA. One of the things that the decline of unions has done in the United States is certainly to diminish an important part of the organization of the Democratic Party around white working class voters. Unions were never as central to the Democratic Party as they are to, say, the Labor Party in the UK or the Labor Party in Australia. But nonetheless, they were an important source of organisation and support for Democratic candidates. And as they have got weaker, so that organisation has got weaker. I would say, though, that we are actually seeing some real flourishes at the moment of not just reunionisation, but quite radical reunionisation in some places around the country, in some sectors. It's not going back to anything like what it used to be, but in the same way that Trump has had this sort of mass mobilization and mass cultural effect on the United States, he's also had many, many backlash effects. And one of those things has been people realizing the importance of unions. Just some of the kinds of union mobilizations we've seen during the Trump presidency have included really dangerous teachers' strikes in Oklahoma. Dangerous in the sense not legally protected, but nonetheless they happened and they were effective. We've seen unionization in sectors that hasn't seen it before. So we might be seeing a decline in traditional unions, although there is actually some reunionization going on. That can't compensate for what's being lost, but I think people are realizing the significance of that. Of course, when we talk about the decline of unions in the United States, we're not just talking about some kind of natural process, although certainly some of it is to do with America's changing economic position in the world. It's also to do with laws that states have passed. So-called right-to-work laws, especially in the South and in the Midwest, have had a devastating effect on unions, and it's going to be difficult for unions to recover while those laws are in place. And there was a definite political strategy to that from conservatives. So yes, I do think that the decline of unions has been important politically, but it's a two-way process in terms of how unions and politics have affected each other.
If I could just quickly add the economics, I think, to that. I think the correlation behind the decline of unions is correlated with the loss of bargaining power, especially as it pertains to a lot of mid-skilled, blue-collar manufacturing workers. It's actually one of the explanations for the hollowing out of the middle class, the stagnation of real median wages, taking into account inflation that's been happening in the United States since the 1970s. Unionization is not the only factor, but it is a factor that has been a driver of this. And so, that relationship to political parties, I think, is the other thing we'll have to layer on. So I think for both parties, and I think really the trajectory has been different. So the Democratic Party had moved under President Bill Clinton. There's more of a move to the center. So the kind of moving to the center means that essentially the makeup of the Democratic Party began to look different. And I think because of that, you ended up beginning to see the edges of both parties, but also, as we're talking about working class voters, not really moving with the center. In fact, they become more disaffected. And so some of the movement towards the Republican Party in the Rust Belt was still quite a surprise, because traditionally those are Democratic voters. Mm-hmm. But there is this economic overlay of, does the Democratic, remember Bill Clinton was the one who put through NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, so have they embraced free trade, which a lot of voters associate as another factor in this stagnation? And it is a factor. But I should stress, it's not the main factor, just like unionization is not the main factor, but they're all factors. So the shift in the 90s to kind of what we in the UK would call the third way, in the United States, the kind of the Bill Clinton shift towards free trade, I think all of that began to change the Rust Belt, and voters began to think of the Republicans, which by the way is traditionally the free trade party, as the one that better represents their interests. So I think that is something that still needs to play out, not beyond this election.
Let me, Jeff, I want to double back to just on the bipartisanship question, and I want to actually reframe it a little bit or add to it. So the question is there anybody, if it's Biden and he reaches out to the center or tries to, is there anybody on the other side to meet him in the Republican Party, But I think there's another side to this. You and I have talked about this before, is if he moves in this direction, if he tries to move towards the center, and given that it's divided government, there's going to be strong imperatives to do it in a way, he's going to have problems within his own coalition between the kind of progressive end of the party and the more moderate Democrats. And so what does that mean? Does he do that, or does he steal a leaf from Donald Trump and frankly, presidents before him, and rely on executive authority and discretion and basically not try to rule to the extent that he can, rely on legislative consent.
Well, there's a couple of the layers to it. So a lot of it depends on what McConnell's willing to do.
Yeah.
If you're asking about it from Biden's perspective, he would very much be committed to a center-left agenda that could draw people from the Republicans to support selected things. That's what he would want. Earlier, you framed it about, what about the Lincoln Project and these guys? Their view is that a healthy country would have a vibrant center-left party and a center-right party, and the Republican Party would be the center-right party, and that's where they would want to be.
Right.
They think that an unhealthy country is unhealthy if you have an extreme party at either end, Bernie Bros or Trumpists, but that the Trumpists toward fascism is worse if that were the choice. They were prepared to support Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders if they were nominated. They prefer Biden, but what's behind all that is they think that the Republican Party needs to be burned down in order to be rebuilt. They want the current, they think that it's morally corrupt, the Republican Party, not financially corrupt, but morally corrupt. And it needs to be destroyed and rebuilt as a principled center-right party that thinks of its partisan adversaries as adversaries, not enemies, that are willing to forge deals for the different understandings of the common interest of the country, and all that. And so they are going to be supporting Biden 1,000%. And that means they're going to be supporting his attempts to make deals. And they're going to be supporting him if he says, I can't make a deal. We're going to have to go for some medical plan that you guys don't like, with my Pelosi coalition and all that sort of stuff. They're simply going to back Biden whatever he wants to do.
Okay, look, we've got we have a string of questions that are about the international implications of the election, but of course they're framed in part, they're factoring in domestic politics, and one of them comes from Yao Ming Hui, I think that's how you pronounce the last name, that essentially asks this: if Biden wins, will America really become less internationalist? So how baked in is America first? Is kind of trade nationalism, protectionism? A related question to this is, what are the implications? There's a few people that have asked this. What are the implications of this election? And especially, I think people are saying if Biden is elected, for geopolitics in East Asia, and especially the US-China relationship, will it really make a difference? Or will Biden have to more or less maybe toning down the rhetoric, but follow a line relatively similar to Trump? And then a final question, which in a sense addresses or brings us to the Europe side of the equation, is what does this mean for climate change? Of course, climate, it refers to the world, but the point of this question is, if Biden is elected, does the US go back into Paris Climate Treaty? And I think kind of more generally, Linda, you picked some of this up in your opening comments. How much of an emphasis can we really expect a Biden presidency with, as Mina is suggesting, if he will have very little of a mandate? How much can we really expect him to push the needle internationally on issues like climate? So 3 different questions. Maybe, Linda, maybe you take the first bite of the apple. David, this is the China part is in your region. So very broadly defined. But really, all of you, any of you. But Linda, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Peter. Great questions. Love LC. I love these events. I mean, just LSE is such great audiences. So thank you all for these. Will it really be the end to America first? No. I think the degree of internal focus is going to remain. And there's a lot to talk about there. But let me just sort of summarize and say, the backlash against globalization that we see in many parts of the advanced economies is really pronounced in the United States because of the economic trends that I mentioned a moment ago. 4 decades of stagnant real median wages and a sense that America has more open markets than, say, China. And this is I think this is the point really worth stressing, is that the distributional impact of being open of trade and investment has not been addressed. And it's very difficult to address, but it has not been addressed. So I think all of that sort of underpins a focus on how do you make trade fair and therefore putting America first. And I think it's a bit of a, for economists, we, this is obviously a problem. And the labels don't help in many respects because, balancing domestic distributional impact, how you address it through domestic policy and the way that you open up to trade, that is the shift, not just in the United States, but actually, as I say, this is a common across advanced economies. So I think for that reason, we'll continue to see increasingly domestic considerations play in. What we would hope for is that they play in a way that is more rules-based under a Biden administration, and also uses domestic policy to address the inequalities, which are never solely about trade. It's always a part of it. So what are the other parts of it? How you deal with automation, how you deal with skills. Those are the kinds of domestic policy frameworks that are needed to address this. But this, I think, America first, or the focus domestically, is here to stay. And I've already touched on geopolitics in terms of US and China. Under a Biden administration, the US-China competition will continue. Remember, the Asia pivot strategy was the Obama administration pivoting to East Asia, but excluding China, the biggest economy in the region. And I still remember a Chinese policymaker saying to me that the vice president came and he told us all about their Asia pivot strategy. And the Chinese people in the room kind of sat there and said, do we need our own regional strategy? And I think, so that I think is going to also remain, with us. And I think the US under Biden will continue to have a strong presence in East Asia, not just economically, but otherwise. But maybe David, as a kind of honorary Asian, Australians are in Asia, can pick that up. And I guess just very quickly on climate change in Paris, it'd be interesting to see how much of the Green New Deal, which is obviously coming from a part of the Democratic Party, begins to, I think, gather some of the momentum from the states on this issue. And climate change, the climate crisis, is a massive issue for many in the Democratic Party. Now, in terms of how much of a mandate he has, how much of a priority this will be, I'll leave it to David and maybe Mina.
Yes. So in Australia, we're always in this very exciting position of being caught between our 2 biggest trade partners, the US and China. And my feeling is that even if Biden wins, hostilities have been escalated to the point where it's not going to be easy to de-escalate them. And I mean, Trump's trade war was actually one of the most popular things that he did with Congress. He had quite a lot of support from Democrats in Congress for the trade war, even though it was very badly directed and very impulsive, and actually represented a real narrowing of the conflict. I mean, under Obama, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as Linda mentioned, this was essentially a way of trying to build an Asian economic order linked to an Asian strategic order that would exclude and constrain China. It was a major vision that the US then dropped because of the domestic politics of the 2016 election, where it was framed essentially by Trump and also by Sanders as this is just another bad trade deal that'll hurt American workers. But it had a major strategic purpose that went beyond that. What we instead see with Trump is this obsessive focus on trade deficits driving that war. And Australia has been quite uncomfortable about this, or at least it was for a while, because of the idea that this was actually leaving the major underlying issues between China and the US untouched. The major issue is not the trade deficit. There are all kinds of other issues, far more basic features of the international order. Those haven't been resolved at all. Those won't be resolved by any kind of tokenistic, pseudo-favorable deal that comes out of a trade war where China offers to buy $50 billion worth of US agricultural products. So I don't think that things are going to be easily de-escalated. It'll be interesting to see if Biden gets elected, if he tries to return to Obama's strategy. I think he'll find it very difficult, because I think he'll find it very difficult to do anything, especially if Republicans control the Senate. I'll leave it to Mina now.
Mina.
Yeah, well, and actually just picking up on what you just said, David, and what Linda had said starting earlier, Linda, when you were talking about free trade in the 1990s, right, this was kind of a given in American politics, right, that free trade, the economics of public policy, that debate has shifted dramatically in the last 5 to 6 years. There was a little bit of that in the Bush 43 administration as well, right, with CAFTA and so forth. But in the 1990s, the Clinton administration's approach to governance, this third way, we talk about that kind of centrist leadership, that was very significant in foreign policy as well, as far as NAFTA, the big debate about trade, most favored nation status with China, human rights versus economic interests. That whole, the kind of centrist consensus that we had in the 1990s that that free trade was good, that everyone benefits overall, right? The Ross Perot movement, the 1992, right? The kind of the job loss that was seen as kind of focusing on the immediate versus the longer term effects. That debate has changed significantly. And and I think so, to bring it to Biden, Peter, which you had asked about what President Biden would do in foreign policy, he will be very constrained by the fact that the trade debate has changed. The United States has been in, right, with the war in Afghanistan, right now the longest war in US history, the war in Iraq. And Biden, of course, is in the difficult position of, in the Obama administration as vice president, he opposed the so-called the surge in Afghanistan, right, at the end of December 2009. But nevertheless, that was the administration policy. I think that Biden would face significant challenges, or will face, if he does become president, if he wins the election, with negotiating these intra-party debates, but also these larger Democratic Party concerns about what the United States does in the world and what are the immediate effects. And perhaps also with that, what the distribution of the results will be, right? Who benefits and how? And that gets to just what David was saying about what Congress, right? How Congress will react, whether they will, I mean, there's the issue of polarization and whether a divided Congress will make anything possible. But even beyond that, I would say there's underlying that is really a debate about whether a centrist policy is possible. And I think we're seeing more of the kind of the Green New Deal, or just leave the environment alone and just let the economy go forward. We're dealing with extremes, not centrism. We see that in trade. We see that in foreign policy. We see that in questions about criminal justice. Again, when you look at the crime reform bill from the mid-1990s that Biden is facing so much criticism for. There is not a lot of room in American politics as we go into 2021 for centrist policymaking.
Okay, we've got we've got about 10 minutes here, and I still have a lot of questions. I think I'm going to try to take another round of questions, and we'll kind of wrap it up with the questions. So one of the questions comes from Tim Durham, LSE Health Economics Policy student. What's the likelihood of a third party developing that consists of moderate Republicans and centrist Democrats who are pro-business, pro-science, and pro-democracy? So is there any way to kind of unfreeze American politics at this point in time? It's a great question. There's several questions here that are about a different kind of geopolitics, the geopolitics inside the United States, between rural small town America and big city, the big urban metropolitan areas, and the divisions that we do see, and the interesting developments. And I think they will be reflected. They were reflected in 2018, and it seems from the exit polls already in changes in suburbia, and where the suburbs, how the suburbs are aligning. And I think the question might be here, to what extent is, what we're seeing is a fair amount of polarization on different dimensions, but this on a geographic dimension, it's not north-south, and it's not exactly east-west right now, but in so many different ways, you see this kind of urban-rural cleavage in the United States, and it plays itself out on a lot of different policy issues. But there seems like there might be some issues like healthcare, perhaps climate, one would think conceivably trade, where they can be kind of bridged or brokered. So thoughts on these questions? Anybody want to take the third party possibility? David?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic about third-party prospects in the United States. I think the US system, just the way that it's institutionally structured, is particularly unforgiving to third parties, where, I mean, in the US, it's the most single-member district system of them all. Essentially, everything is always a winner-take-all contest, which leaves very little room for third parties to come in. That's not to say that parties can't change in the United States. There have been multiple occasions where one party has broken apart and a new party has arisen. That has always happened over issues of race in the US. That is what brought the Whigs down. It was issues of race that fundamentally changed the Democratic Party and ultimately changed the Republican Party as well. There certainly was speculation when Trump came along that the Republicans could have this major split essentially on an issue of race, essentially on immigration, Trump's very hardline stance against immigration, which a lot of Republicans didn't agree with. Unfortunately, though, I would say the Republican Party has become Trump's party, and it will be for the foreseeable future, even if he loses. So I don't see the Republican Party breaking apart and giving rise to a new formation. There is some possibility of cooperative formations arising in Congress between relatively liberal Republicans and very relatively conservative Democrats. But we have to note, we're at a time in the US where Democrats and Republicans in Congress are basically further apart than ever. I think it was in 2012 that for the first time, the most right-wing Democrat in Congress was to the left of the most left-wing Republican. So even though this is the sort of thing that people who observe American politics would often like to see, I'm afraid I don't see it happening.
Any thoughts on the party politics question here? Jeff, you,
I just completely agree with that. There was a hope that the scenario that he described of the breakdown of a party and the formation of a new one rather than
right,
the third party per se was viable, and that depended upon a crushing defeat of Trump. And so David's first point that Trump and Trumpism lives on forecloses that possibility. And it also has this other effect, which is that, you know, the theme of Biden's administration is going to be a return to normalcy. A lot of that can be accomplished without any public policy debate. I mean, he has to rebuild a government that has been, you know, torched from the inside. I mean, all of these bureaucratic agencies are just destroyed. DOJ, Department of State, their institutional cultures are a mess. People have left. They have to be restaffed. But all that stuff can be done without having a big policy debate. When you get to the policy debate stuff, I think it's like you say, Peter, that it's going to end up being easier to do some of these things unilaterally than because of David's point. Trump isn't going away, and he's going to mobilize people to be harsher in their critiques of proposed policies than the policies would warrant, and that Republicans previously may not have even felt. Yeah.
that's great. Mina and then Linda, maybe close it out. We've got just, we have 3 minutes before the platform closes down or whatever happens to the platform. Yeah.
I'll be quick. Let me just say that I agree entirely with the institute. We see here institutions, right? As far as the third party, the American political system is designed for a majority party and an opponent. Winner take all, plurality elections, very few runoffs, Georgia being one exception, but that is designed, makes it very difficult for third parties to play an active role in agenda setting and policy making. They can be spoilers, they can certainly influence, think Green Party, think Libertarian Party, but they are generally not able, at least in national politics, to have a seat at a political seat. As far as suburban versus urban and rural voters, we do see that shift. Urban voters tend to stay Democratic. Rural voters have been for Trump. Suburban voters went for Trump in 2016. In 2018, in the midterms, shifted. And then again in 2020, appear to have shifted. This is the kind of the key block that I think both parties are trying to recruit. And I certainly see that in the Hofstra poll, which focuses on suburban voters. We see that's certainly the big question going forward after this election. Is there a way to bridge that gap? I would say easier between urban and suburban than urban, suburban versus rural. That's it.
Okay, that's great. Linda.
I know we're out of time, so I would just say the COVID, in terms of working from home, I think that's actually going to make the rural-urban divide, Peter, that that you asked about from a very good question from a viewer, and what Mina has described, even more important. So the concentration in urban areas of Democrats, even in Republican states, as working from home remains with us and you get more dispersion into the suburbs, how much purpling are we going to find? And I think that's going to be one of the key issues. And I guess finally, I know we've all said this, but this election is, it's fascinating, it's taking too long, it's all these things, but I really hope that by the end of it, the process can be improved, because this mail-in ballot, the kind of, all the things that we've described, it just, to me, it's just kind of adding to, one of the big challenges to democracy, which is, as I'm sure this is something that all of us feel, is that democracy is not an outcome only, it's actually a process. And I really do worry about everything which is coming up. But that being said, having events like this, I always feel slightly more informed by the end. So thank you, Peter, for this, and let's do more.
And more hopeful, I think. So that's great. So ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to our distinguished panelists today. I want to thank all of you for joining us, Mina, David, Jeff, and Linda, many thanks to you for taking time to share your thoughts about the US election. I'm sure that our viewers found it. I mean, we just had just tons of questions. I wish we could have gotten more. We got to over 100 questions coming in from all over the place. I mean, people were joining us from, I saw at one point from China, France, Canada, David, some folks from Australia, Norway. So you have a fan club. You have a fan club everywhere. I found it very helpful and constructive, and I'm sure our viewers do as well. So to everyone, from all of us at the US Center, at the LSE, stay healthy, stay safe, and probably stay 2 meters apart. Take it easy, everybody. See you soon. Bye now. Thanks.